Okay, thank you all for coming to this session. I'll start with the introductions. This is a session called Improving Dissemination and Discovery in the Knowledge Cycle. And we are a collaborative approach from publishing to library. So starting with David, he's the head of modern collections at the University of Basel and secretary of the Acquisition and Collection Development section at the IFLA. Then comes John from JSTOR, Senior Vice President of Publisher Content at JSTOR, and John Elwell, who's the Senior Vice President of Books for EBSCO. And both John and John are Board of Trustees, Open Access eBook Data Trust. And I'm Vanessa. I'm the Director of Marketing and Sales at Amsterdam University Press. So we are going to, well, these I think you have seen a couple of times, so we all know how important accessibility is. We'll start with this slide. When we were talking, we came up with a shared mission and economy, and wanted to talk through the roles that we all have in the publishing or in the ecosystem. You can call it a value chain, you can call it a supply chain. I think value chain is the nicest for us, and we wanted to give everybody a chance to add their value to the chain and explain what we do. So for me, if you don't mind, I'm going to sit down. So as a publisher, we are creating the content. So we are very author-centered. We look at the authors as they are the most important people that we have in our community. They create the content. We would be nowhere without it. So we have a very close relationship with them, and we really build the content with them. So they do their research, but we add to that in terms of services. We support them, we help them through editing, we help them through peer review processes, we build tools for them, and once the manuscript is there to go into production, we add metadata, all the way through to dissemination and the partners that we work with. So we also make sure that there's different variations of the content to be used. So ebooks, print books. In the future, there will be accessible ebooks. And make sure that our relationships downstream, because what we're talking about here in this session is university presses, mid-sized, small, humanities, social sciences, and the ones that in particular do not have their own platform. So we're dependent on the middleman, which is this part here. So I'll hand it over to John.
Thank you very much. If you want to, you can just click the slide. So I love this chart because it really shows the complexity. So credit to Laura Ricci and Clark and Exposito for building this out. But if you think about it, the publisher, Vanessa in this case, they do tremendous work to create the book, right? It is years of effort really to create that single book from the author perspective and the publisher perspective. And they have to trust that it's going to get through that game of telephone, right? It is very dense and complex. And if you think about it, let's just say that Amsterdam University Press has 10 metadata fields they want to make sure get communicated. And they do it across 100 books, right? So we're at 1,000 pieces of data. JSTOR takes it at that point. They have about 200,000 titles, right? So 10 of those, metadata fields for each of those, we're up to 2 million. By the time it gets to Gobi, there's about 10 million books. 10 of those are at 100 million data points right off the jump, very quickly. And it has to get through that somehow. So it's really fun to be part of this panel and have this conversation because there's parts that are just blind. Depending on where you are in the workflow, there's stuff that I don't get to see, that John doesn't, Vanessa, David. And it's only by us talking together can we actually understand what's happening here and be able to put the context around how all of that works in how we're delivering values to the end users, to the researchers, and then that information back to the publisher. So it really does have to be a two-way street.
All right, so, of course, and I got to go to the red here. Oh, I got there. So the first part here, we look at it from the aggregator side, right? So went through the process of being published, and the work that John had mentioned happens on that side. Then it comes down to the aggregator, so the publisher, which is trusting in the relationships that they would have here. So Vanessa, University of Amsterdam Press, and JSTOR, we have a relationship where we help aggregate. As an aggregator, we work to provide their content to the library community to be able to access that, and to the end users to get access to it. First thing we do is do a metadata creation. A lot of times, content will come in as a full PDF. JSTOR breaks those PDFs into chapter, creates customized metadata for each of those chapters to ensure, as you can see here, that that gets discovered in the way that a journal article does, that a research report would. Can be searched and cross-searched with other primary source material. There are 73 billion words on JSTOR, so you want to make sure when a user's searching for something that the metadata is consistent and that can be discovered in the same way. And the next is coming really more on distribution. So University of Amsterdam Press is relying on a partner like JSTOR to have the library connections. And we have relationships with 17,000 libraries. And they're trusting that we're going to be representing their content, that we're going to have the right kind of models that adjust and adapt for the way that different types of institutions acquire content, and that their content is going to be represented in the way that they want it to be represented to the library community or those that are looking to acquire the content. Then, and this is also then about access and discovery. And this part gets really important. I just put one general slide here that looks at the differences between where discovery occurs on Google, JSTOR Direct, where it could come through discovery service providers. And the key aspect of that then is not only in the metadata, but in the indexing, and then working within the indexing and sharing of metadata to discovery service partners, close collaboration with Google or other commercial search engines, in particular where around the world, there's a lot more reliance on utilizing a Google or Google Scholar for searching content than there may be directly on an aggregator platform. And last is about usage and analytics, and this is important. So, we'll hear a little bit as we talk further. It's important to know, and for Vanessa to understand, like how your content's being used, where sales are occurring, what trends are occurring in that market. So ensuring that we share institutional level usage data, country level usage data, subject area usage data, data down to the author, so the authors can understand what the impact of their scholarship has in the global market. So being able to share the data analytics is another critical component of that. So now I'll turn it over to you, David, on the next piece.
Yeah. Oh, this one. Yeah. How do I go back?
I'll go back. You go back to the
To this slide, yes. Well, when we are talking about how to define our roles, I looked at this slide again and I realized, well, dissemination, that's really something librarians want to have. We buy books to be read, not to be just on the shelf. Access, very important as well. Preservation, of course, it's a core library task. And of course, we want to make sure that all the readers get their material. But the readers are usually at the university library where I am working. They're usually also authors. And myself, I'm also an author, so I was thinking about bringing this aspect in as well. And I was thinking about when do I, as an author, actually need a librarian? For my PhD, I didn't need that because my supervisor told me actually which publisher would be good for my PhD, and I just followed him because he had the experience. One of my following books was within a project, and there the project funder told us actually that they have a contract with this and this publisher, so we have to publish it with this publisher. So I didn't have a choice. It was a good publisher, by the way. From Austria, and so I was quite happy. But then, if I'm publishing my own book, what do I want? Well, I want it to be read, I want it to be disseminated, maybe I wanted to have it open access. Who do I ask? Do I go to every publisher? Do I go to JSTOR? Who do I ask? And this is actually where, when we were talking where the shortcomings are, what the roles are of a librarian, I realized actually that should be my role as a librarian, to not just to tell, to help people to find reading material, but also find an access to the publishing world. And just started to realize that librarians don't seem to see themselves as part of the market. They see themselves outside of the market. And this is where we started to talk, actually, and this is why we are here.
I'm fast forwarding to, whoops, to this one.
Perfect. So like through the conversations that were happening, kind of felt there were like three sort of themes and discussion topics that kept coming up and questions we kept asking each other and working through with each other. So what we wanted to do during the rest of the session is to kind of talk through that together around some of these points, to say like, what were those challenges and were there some conclusions? And John will conclude towards the end, are there any action items and next steps we should take that really try to help work through the resolutions there? So to start us off, and I know Vanessa and I were talking some time ago, and you had kind of mentioned at that, like where these challenges existed. And you and David then had a chance to really sit down and talk as you're like, well, what's the library's role in these challenges that I'm hearing about and that David is surfacing to you? So maybe if you can talk a little bit about how that conversation with you and David went.
Yeah, so as a university press without having their own content platform, I'm never in contact with libraries. And I think one of the things that I realized was we have a lot of contracts going with transaction agreements with vendors, with discovery services. And so I talk to them because there's an actual relationship that is based on a piece of paper online or paper. So that relationship for me was undeniably there, but then I realized I don't have any official relationship with the libraries because we do not contact them directly, we depend on people. And the funny thing is that when David and I met about a year ago at a conference, we kind of joked around saying, what do you know about publishers? And he was like, well, what do you know about libraries? I was like, well, I don't know anything about libraries. I don't even know if my books are in your library or if they're discoverable. And we both immediately, we were triggered. And the first thing we sort of latched onto was metadata. Like, okay, so we create metadata. Can you find our books? And we started testing. And when the testing failed, we were like, okay, let's start meeting people together, a librarian and a publisher. People were shocked. We met with resellers, with aggregators, and they were all like, oh my God, there's a librarian and a publisher in the same meeting. How do we handle this? And it was increasingly interesting. And along the way, I tried to fix things for myself. Like we talked to Nielsen, for example, and I realized, shit, I actually need to fix the relationship, add something to the contract that is missing. So it was step by step that we got intrigued. And little by little, the people in between got pulled in. So yeah.
So David, from the library perspective then, like from what you're hearing Vanessa say, what did you see as some of those challenges, and kind of reiterating what you mentioned earlier where you felt like maybe there's a stronger level of responsibility you could take? Like what are some things that you were thinking about and steps to be able to do that?
Yeah, there were two things. What you mentioned with the metadata, Yeah, I told you at that, when we met at this conference, that, well, you know, the publishers could put in some more metadata so your books can be retrievable. And that triggered you because you actually do put a lot of metadata into the system which never arrives at the library.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about that, and I think the understanding that there is a publisher who was exactly the same as me as a librarian, that was the interesting part of it. And why people were shocked in between, because they didn't know actually what's happening to the metadata either. And so one thing I realized is that libraries have absolutely no idea about the system they are part of. And so that was a learning I had to make. And just in that time, an author seek contact and said, I want to publish my research somewhere. And I suddenly, because we started talking, suddenly I had a little bit more information, and that was a wonderful discussion. And I just realized that's actually the role of a librarian to tell this author, this professor, if you publish with this publisher, then what happens to your work? Who can read your work? Who can access it? Who can find it at all? What about open access? Well, there is a whole other world about open access. They have a program here. They have a program there. Go rather with them if you want this. Go rather with them if you want that. And this was a knowledge she didn't know. This professor didn't know. I didn't have previously, and you didn't know either.
No, and that's the shared space is that author. We depend on the authors, but you also depend on the researchers. So we have a shared space that we need to bring together somehow.
Yeah, and it was really enjoyable as we've sat down and talked through this a number of times, is there's been a few moments where Vanessa will say, like, well, we create that. Why doesn't that get there? And then John and I are both, well, we can't. And there's certain things that we're doing that surprise, like, you're enhancing what? Or you're building this into your platform how? And it's the sharing of knowledge that goes through of what people do and don't know. Something is very common maybe from a platform or an e-commerce perspective that the publisher or the researcher librarian doesn't get to see. It's not transparent, it's not easily there to find, there's no way for them to look into that. But over the course of these conversations, we found so many different spots of connection where it was like an aha moment. And it's just been really fun to have these dialogues and kind of see that really confusing chart again, be able to start picking out the pieces and seeing how it starts at the beginning and at the end.
Yeah, I'll say one of the interesting things that Vanessa was surprised by when we have a program on Path to Open that works direct with publishers releasing new copyright year content, and it moves into an open access space. And one of the things that was important for we trying to get from publishers is, what is the author affiliation? Like, so what university are the authors affiliated with that are publishing in there? And we really weren't able to get that information. And it took a lot of time with follow-up with publishers to try to get that, because libraries would like to know, are my faculty publishing, and where are they publishing, and what the impact of that is, to help bring the knowledge to the areas that David was talking about. When I brought that up with Vanessa, the person's like, what? Like, we create all that. How is that not making its way over to you? And then why are you then having to reach out to ask for that information again when we're delivering that? So I think University of Amsterdam Press might be doing that, but there are many other presses that feels like don't. But even when you're doing that, it's getting stripped and lost in the process before it makes it over to us as an aggregator to actually create the metadata to put that onto the platform. And that's when we started to realize the more we dig into it, the more we see there is a lot of work being done with presses, a lot of work that's being done in areas in here, but there's something broken because we have to keep reinventing it. So there keeps adding cost to redo something that somebody's already done.
Yeah, and that's where we even talked about the faculty plans at Gobi, where Gobi's tagging the faculty affiliations, because that's the only way the libraries can see that, even though Amsterdam is generating that in the front end. So it's just, it definitely is, there is leakage of information throughout that cycle. And it's something we have to be more efficient about.
Yeah, and it's not even, we're not even talking about small pieces of information. What we discovered while talking is, no, it's author information. It's like really essential pieces of information. It's not the small stuff. I mean, at Amsterdam, we've been busy, I mean, and it's been a wonderful project, but at some point I thought, what am I doing? Is we are creating really beautiful, detailed chapter metadata. And I finally got it to pour into an Onyx, and then the Onyx provider said, nobody can take it. And I was like, oh my God. Really? We have it now and nobody wants it? So yeah, so it's complicated.
Just to put out, how many librarians are here? Awesome. So how many of you have that close relationship or collaboration with a publisher? Anyone? All right. Are there thoughts or ideas or suggestions that any of you have that, or you think of to feel like, hey, this is something that I've seen work, or something where I feel like a library and a publisher have been able to have better collaboration? Yes.
I guess, yes, I would love to have a better relationship, especially because sometimes, so I work a lot with journals, but I can see we also have problems with books where we find that the metadata is not right, but, and sometimes we submit it through their support desk and say, this is just not right. But sometimes it seems like it's more fundamental than that, and we don't really know we don't know who to contact, basically, other than if you have a support desk. That's about the only place that we go. Sorry.
No, it's not. I didn't get off your mouse. It's for the recording. There we go.
So as a library, we would like to have better relationships with publishers because we just find out things ad hoc, usually when there's someone finds a problem in using the data. But we would rather fix the problem in the beginning as opposed to us reporting it even at the end. And sometimes when you report it at the end, that one single problem is fixed, but it's not really fixing the supply chain problem. Whatever that may be. I'd also really like to better understand why data can't be accepted if it's a standard like Onyx.
Yeah, it's an interesting landscape, and I think a lot of it is already when partners of ours switch from 2.1 to 3 Onyx, things get lost along the way. It's like it's almost, it feels like you're losing your luggage. So I had a conversation with an aggregator, and we were talking about a specific series, and he said, "Oh, I'll check how many of the books in the series that we have in our system," and it was half, and I just said, "Well, that's not possible." And he said, "Well, I think the series tag got lost when we switched our Onyx," and I was like, "No, how do we fix it?" He said, "Can you manually, in a spreadsheet, send it to me?" And I was like, "No, really?"
Are we on? I'm Bruce Pensick from Virginia Tech, and I am, among other things, a public administration librarian. And when I hear Europeans talking about adding value, I think about supply chains where the value-added tax is part of it. I think about things like, how does e-commerce work within and across EU boundaries? And who has been addressing these problems on the commercial side that we might take their models, if not necessarily their vendors, as an example?
So you wanna?
I don't have a good answer for that one. It feels like that's more of a EU-directed question.
I'll use my parade ground voice.
I don't know. Again, I'm throwing this out. I'm not a business librarian, so I don't know how the literature may have addressed these problems, but it seems to me there has to be the same problem on the taxation side, on the inventory control side of keeping track of how they're moving product, that there are analogous problems, and are there analogous potential solutions if we start thinking that, and this pains me to say, that it's not a library thing, it's not an information thing, it's a commerce thing.
So okay, thank you. That helped clarify it a little bit. And I think one of the things that makes this a little more complicated is if we're talking about fixing something like that or making it more efficient for an Amsterdam University Press, that's absolutely doable. When you start looking across thousands of publishers, it's not all the same, right? So the metadata that's coming in the Onyx feed from Amsterdam is not the same as some other publishers. So now when you start looking across that whole, how do you standardize it? How do you gain efficiency and scale to that degree, right? And when you start looking at print versus digital, how do you source that? How do you make that available? How is that all tied in together? That's building so much complexity to the system that someone way further down the chain, like a Gobi, has to interject themselves, and that's why, to use the faculty example again, even though Amsterdam's providing the faculty information, we're sitting there having to build a faculty database. Because when you get to the end of the chain, it's not there consistently enough from enough publishers. So I think having these conversations is a great way, if there's one or two, and we're going to jump into one of the things I'm going to talk about in the conclusion, but if there's something to start with, right, how can you follow it all the way through the system? And just start small, because you're going to be able to find so many things that you can gain efficiency from if you focus on one or two of the smaller things and track it all the way through. And you'll also learn that there's stuff probably happening that will benefit you in your library and probably save you some time too.
Yeah, and I think there's also some common denominators. So we all use classification systems, right? So you want to be able to trust that the choice of classification, if we all use a variation of classification systems, that at least that gets through the system, because we all need bisects, we all need, well, themas now. There's a couple of those. Keywords is something that we all probably put to a certain extent into our data. Even that, those things are they're not filtering through, so you cannot, because that's exactly what we were doing. So when we were checking books, literally going through the system, we were, at one point, we had one or two books as an example, and I said, okay, this is the data that we put in. These are the classification codes and keywords. And we went through, we had meetings with different aggregators, different discovery services, and every time we brought up this specific book, they all had different codes. It was incredible. And a lot of them are being also created by organizations themselves, by the vendors, and you would think it's enriching, right? They add to it, it's enriching, but codes get lost along the way, and the bisect codes that David was seeing were different from the ones that we had put in to start with, which was an incredible discovery for us.
Yeah, and there are two problems with that. One is, you might not be interested because if you bought the book, it's done for you. That's what my assumption was in the beginning. But the other thing is, the enigma. You called it the enigma the other day.
Vanessa called you the enigma.
You were the enigma.
You're an enigma. Don't put it on me.
Well, yeah, it might be enigmatic how a librarian chooses what he wants to have in his collection, and that's also based on data because the profiles are based on data. And sometimes your data, which would be correct and would be actually appearing on my desk or on my screen, is not appearing.
No.
Because something went lost along the way. And that's one of the problems, and and I think the understanding, for me, the understanding of the industry is much bigger than at the beginning of our talks. But the understanding on the publisher side, what does the librarian actually do to choose the content?
Yeah, the selection process.
That's a different thing. And we talked about it. There are many librarians here, so it's more the content and not the content, the author, the topic related to the research in my specific university, and not the publisher, really. There are many publishers. We buy from thousands of publishers, and that's not the most important thing. And I think this is also a learning for you, that the brand is not enough.
No, and I think throughout this whole exercise of about a year, I let go of the brand. I was like, I don't care if we're talking about, it's the examples that I have, but Amsterdam University Press is not what matters. What matters is that the content is being discovered. So you you lose and I think that relates to how I first thought librarians would look at me as a publisher. Do they see me as a salesperson or a shark? Or I didn't know. I didn't know how to be normal and not to be like, I didn't want to be threatening or putting up a show and I learned that we're all there for the same reason, which is actually really nice to know that we're 4 different parts of that chain wanting exactly the same thing. And yes, we all work for companies or for institutions, but that is beside the point.
But just one more thing, what comes out of it. You mentioned that your brand is not important, but still it's an important thing that you don't have a platform.
Yes.
That means you are disadvantaged in this world where I see the platform of publishers who have a platform. I see the big ones. And for me as a librarian, it's important not to give all my money to one publisher, 2 publishers, 10 publishers. I want 1,000. I want diversity. And only because if there is diversity, I can actually serve my readers, because they need diversity. They also need the niche publishers where they can bring on their products or their books.
Just when you, go ahead, sorry.
No, please.
Well, just as you're talking, even from an author perspective, right? You need the niche publishers because those are the only places where that might get published.
Exactly.
Right? There's a lot that gets published from Springer or TNF or whoever, but that might not be the piece of scholarship that you really need.
Exactly.
That's where you need those mid-tiers. That's where you need the small UPs. Yeah.
Perfect. So, obviously, we felt it was important that we focused on that problem, and we've actually, you can probably tell as we're going through, we spent a lot of time trying to work through and find and pinpoint some very specific things that we feel we can actually find solutions for. And so what we wanted to try to get to now as we're closing is, you heard a lot of some of the challenges that are out there. Now, what are some possible solutions we came up with together that we would want to take as some next steps? So John's going to kind of highlight and put some of that into some summary, and we'll start talking about some of these conclusions we came as next steps. Like, how do we start solving the problem? We can talk about the problem pretty well, but then we want to start feeling how we solve it. We also kind of realize we're not going to solve it all, but we got to start somewhere. Start with something that feels like it's manageable, find a solution for it, and move forward. So turn it to you, John, just to kind of get some conclusions and next steps in here.
Yeah, and I think we have about 5 minutes left, so this is also a good time. If there's any questions that you all want us to get to or anything you'd like to ask, now would be a perfect time for it.
Did you include operational or engineering staff in this analysis?
You're too quick for me.
And there,
Did you improve operational staff or engineering and QA people when you did these analysis of why data wasn't flowing? Because I feel like these are operational issues.
They are operational issues, and absolutely. So I mean, John and I have a lot of staff who focus on this very topic. So absolutely, they were included and represented through us as part of the conversation.